Let's talk about paraphrasing Scripture as a method of Bible study. I know some people, when they think of paraphrasing Scripture, they think, we can't do that. We shouldn't do that. We should take Scripture as it's written. Let's talk about the purpose of paraphrasing Scripture for a minute here. The idea, when we're paraphrasing Scripture as a study tool, is not that we're trying to rewrite the Scripture. It's that we're trying to get a firm enough grip on Scripture that we can phrase it and put it in our own terminology. The idea is to get into the intent of the author. It's not to change the intent. It's not to modify Scripture. It's not to do anything like that. It's to get into the intent of the author in such a way that we can visualize what the author is trying to say. That we can visualize ourselves in the same situation trying to give the same message that the author is. And to do that, we have to have a full understanding of the message that the author is trying to bring. And paraphrasing, doing the process of trying to go through and paraphrase what the author says, draws us into that intent. So the idea is really to try to get such a grip on what the author is saying that we can say the same thing to people who we would be around. Now, paraphrasing Scripture tends to, personally for me, I prefer to use it more with didactic or teaching passages of Scripture. So I think it works very, very well for something like the epistles or some of the prophets in the Old Testament. Any place where the author, the writer, is trying to convey a specific message, is trying to teach a specific thing. Some people like to use it with narrative passages of Scripture, storytelling passages. I see its value more in the didactic, but that's just me personally. You may like to do it in different ways. So here's how we practice paraphrasing Scripture. We're going to start with a relatively small passage of Scripture. Now, we want a passage that's going to be complete. All right, so we're not just taking 2 or 3 verses. We want a completed thought. Typically, when I'm going through the epistles or something like that, like a half a chapter works fairly well. I want to find, if I'm going to go through and paraphrase Scripture, I want to find a logical starting point and a logical stopping point. A lot of our Bibles now have little headings, and the heading usually gives a pretty good break point. So I can find a section that I want to work through a paraphrasing exercise on, and I can normally be fairly comfortable starting at the beginning of that section and stopping when I get to the end. I can normally feel fairly comfortable. That's a logical start and stop point. First thing we're going to do is we're going to read the passage over in its entirety. Now, at this point, we're just trying to get a sense of a feel for the entire section, what the author is trying to say in that entire section. So we read it over, we take a minute, we reflect on it, we think about what are the key things the author is trying to say, what are the key points he's trying to communicate. When we feel like we've got a pretty good sense for the passage as a whole, then we're going to start working with paraphrasing. And we're going to take out a notepad and a pen or something like that. And for me, I like to do this in fairly small sections. A sentence, maybe 2, maybe a verse. And what I'll do is I'll read it over, and I'll think about it in the context of everything that I just read when I read the entire passage. And I'll look at the intent of the author, and I'll try to determine what is it that the author is really trying to communicate. One of the things this does, by the way, is it makes it very, very difficult for us to just skip over passages. It makes us, actually get into verses that we may struggle with at certain times. We have to actually stop and think about it and process it and try to make it fit. So I'll read it and I'll think, how would I try to communicate the same thought? If I was in the author's position and I was trying to communicate, how would I say it? What would I, how would I phrase it? How would I try to put it in a way that people could get it? And then I'll write out my paraphrase for that particular verse or sentence. After I've done that for 2 or 3 times, then sometimes I'll go back through and I'll read back over my paraphrase, and then I'll read back over the original text and say, am I faithfully representing? Am I faithfully understanding and representing what the text says? And this is a way of me just checking to make sure that I am actually on track. and that I am accurately representing, accurately paraphrasing it. And so I work all the way through the entire passage this way. And I have to work at it verse by verse, sentence by sentence, to snag something out of the Old Testament, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. And I've got to work through every single piece of it and try to make it fit into a coherent whole. And one of the benefits I find from it is it really makes me process that entire passage in a much, much deeper way than just reading over it and even taking a few minutes to reflect on it. It really draws me into the passage because now I have to put myself in the position of the author. So that's the way I will practice the principle of paraphrasing Scripture. Couple of passages, if you want to try it. A couple of passages it would be good for you to get started on. Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. Might be a really good one for you to start on practice with. Read over the passage as a whole, then go back through, paraphrase it one sentence, one verse at a time. Another one that might be really interesting, Romans chapter 14, by the way, is a teaching passage where Paul is writing about our responsibility to God and judging each other in light of that. Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 31, Paul's Sermon on Mars Hill, is another good one that we can practice with. So, if it appeals to you, I really suggest you give it a try. Paraphrasing, I find to be a very engaging approach to Scripture. Very challenging, very thought-provoking, and very rich and fulfilling approach to Scripture. So, I challenge you to try it if it appeals to you.